lights and sirens, yeah, it's time to go. No time to defund us. You should know that we're not perfect. We're human, we're flawed. Just save us some grace for the sake of us all. We're holding that thin blue line, 'cause that's what we do. We don't do it for the glory, we do it for you.
Hello, everybody. It is your producer of In the Lion's Den, Melissa McAtee. Today we have a very special show of a guest who is new to In the Lion's Den. She's a fellow friend and whistleblower of mine, and so I'm super excited to have her on. Today's episode is called The Cost of Truth, a Nurse's Story. And who better to tell it than Jodi O'Malley? If you are unfamiliar with her, she's an MSN RN, and she is a faith-driven nurse and fearless leader. The founder of Nurses Out Loud and Righteous RN LLC, and an accredited provider of nursing continuing professional development. Author of Rare Courage, Standing for Right When You're Surrounded by Wrong. She is a powerful voice for truth in healthcare, equipping professionals to stand with moral courage, speak boldly, and lead with uncompromising integrity in the face of pressure and opposition. And I can say for a fact, knowing Jodi, all of those things are true. I will be in the background enjoying this show, but until then, here is your host, Dr. Bill Lionberger.
Fantastic, Melissa. Welcome, everyone, to In the Lion's Den. Today's guest is truly a story of courage. It is one that is played out over and over, and she is a shining example of standing up for not only belief systems, but the truth for healthcare, for nursing, for patients, and ethics. And you know what she's been through in this process, going all the way back to the whole COVID crazy. So without further ado, Jodi, please join us in the Lion's Den. Hello, Jodi.
Hello. Hi, Dr. Bill.
It's great to have you here. As I've looked over some of your story, and it's so reminiscent of many of the things that we went through, and some of it you're still going through. But I want to get into your story today and really hear about kind of what started it, where it came from, and truly bring some color to what's been going on behind the scenes and why you had to be a whistleblower. So kick it off.
Yeah, so I think for me, it happened very early, recognizing that it was propaganda that I was seeing on the TV everywhere, right? It was just fear, 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 fear. And I had a discerning spirit about that. I was like, what is going on? And the interesting part is that I had just seen Jojo Rabbit, which is a little boy that Hitler is his best friend. And it takes you through their little journey. And I had just seen that a couple months ago with my son in the movie theater. And so I was recognizing propaganda, like it was smacking me in the face. And then I just paid attention. As Melissa said, I'm a master's prepared registered nurse, and education, evidence-based practice, standards of care, protocols are very important to me. I worked in critical care areas. So, we did follow that. And then all of a sudden, all that changed. And then the messaging changed. And then we weren't treating patients. So all of that just smacked me in the face to pay attention, research. I mean, I literally started with Public Health Policy 101, and we violated that. So that's kind of how it started.
And I wouldn't even say that you're complicit so much as, you were given like orders, right, from the hospital. And from what I understand about your story, I mean, you're going about your business, doing your nursing and your critical care thinking, right, in terms of what you think should happen. Maybe you can give us an example of what was like a moment of change for you in that process where you're doing your thing, and then all of a sudden it changes.
Well, I'm doing my thing in February. In May, I was asked to be house supervisor. So I was controlling the hospital on my shift, right? Talking to doctors, lab, housekeeping, whatever. And then we started telling patients not to come into the hospital. That to me, and then our standards of care, like how do we treat people who are overwhelmed, say their respiratory system's overwhelmed. We weren't doing any like antibiotics to prevent secondary infections. We were removing the advocate from the bedside. That to me was number one violation right there, because it allowed the standards of care to really change. And at first, the community was like, "Oh, good, we don't have to deal with an advocate, right? We don't have to deal with visitors." But visitors are very important to nursing and to the patient and their recovery. And doctors stopped going into the rooms to assess. Pharmacies stopped going into the rooms to do med reconciliations. Those were the things that really, and then the mask. So the mask was the first thing I would say, probably, when I was like, okay, we only use it for this and this. And then if we really need to be careful for a TB patient, we use an N95, right? But hardly ever do we ever pull the N95s out. So the fact that they were not only pushing fear 24/7 and our standards of care changed, but then we're wearing masks that do nothing. And to me, removing the advocate from the bedside. I mean, I saw a lot of people, they lost their will to go, to move on. And protocols with experimental medications, the PCR test that was experimental, all of that combined, Dr. Bill was like, hello, trying to talk to people at the nurses station. And then you couldn't. It became political. And yeah, it was just a complete detriment to patients and to medical professionals at large.
I remember back when this kicked off, having the same kinds of hairs on the back of my neck go up as things didn't make sense, getting in the fight and working with nurses that had lost their jobs. And they were struggling, trying to figure out, well, what do I do? And so many of them became advocates to help patients actually escape the hospitals, because the families were being kicked out. You bring in your attorney to the hospital, and they couldn't get access. I work in law enforcement also, and so we worked another path, which was welfare checks, getting some officers to go in and do welfare checks, and others that basically would stop at the threshold and wouldn't go in. They're like, well, no, that's their area, this is mine. I'm like, no, that's not really the case. I mean, if somebody's concerned about somebody's welfare, well, they're in the hospital. That's the point. They're worried. And so, things were not adding up. And you were singled out in multiple ways. Maybe you can just give us a little bit of a sense of that, because when you were starting to speak up, right? And you had some interaction with people.
Yeah, so I started speaking up on Facebook, and my book details all of my social media posts and how I got from point A, to blowing the whistle. And what I didn't know is that they were. I learned this later through discovery, that they were already looking at my social medias in the spring of 2020. So they were saying, oh, well, she's not violating HIPAA and this and that. So what I did then was remove all affiliations with the hospital. And I just was asking questions and trying to talk to people. When I finally, and I was blowing the whistle, I just didn't know that that's what it was called. Okay. Because we never heard the term whistleblower really, but I had been blowing the whistle about all of these things that, again, giving the injection, right? How come we didn't get any training on recognizing safety signals? We didn't have any training on that. Nobody was collecting the data. So all of those things, finally in August of 2021 was when my coworker had just received the vaccine 2 weeks prior. And that to me was also a point where she was kind of coerced to do it. People were like, oh, you don't want to be like patient in room 7, and the fear when she had been working with COVID patients for 18 months, right? So she comes into the hospital, she has COVID, vital signs are all normal, but then they started her on the remdesivir. And that's when she came to me and said, hey, those meds that you've been talking about, because I had started talking about that in October of 2020, the ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine protocols. And she said, I want to try that. And that's when I went into advocacy mode and, talked to her nurse, talked to the doctor. The doctor was saying that it was controversial. That's when I called the doctor and the nurse into my office. And I said, respectfully, doc, being controversial is not a reason not to practice medicine. Here's the body of evidence. The patient is requesting it. They left my office. The nurse calls me and says, she's going to order it. A few minutes later, she calls me back and says, pharmacy blocked it. That's when I brought the pharmacist I was house supervisor, into my office, put my phone up, my little Android phone up on the desk, and I hit record because at that point, I was like, oh my gosh, I was seeing red. How is this possible? You're not going to fill a doctor's order. And then she came in the room and said, listen, I was told that if I prescribe it for anything other than lice or scabies, I will lose my job. And I'm not going to lose my job over this.
Yeah. And so, for our listeners that don't necessarily know the protocols, when you use a medication, right, off label, it's a common thing, right? And when you're using one of the safest medications in the compendium of medications with a track record almost second to none that received Nobel Prize accolades and has tremendous amount of broad spectrum use, and then all of a sudden, because the reality is because it works, the system decided that it was going to clamp down. I remember there's 2 reasons though. So the remdesivir piece, right, was only allowed under emergency use if nothing else would help. And if anything else showed some efficacy, then the Fauci remdesivir catastrophe would have not been allowed according to the law. So they had to spin up under emergency use all the ways to demonize the horse paste, the horse medicine, right? So that they wouldn't lose their emergency use for remdesivir, remember it killed 52% of the people in the trial, one of the trials that was going on, and then it got shelved. It actually got shelved because it was too dangerous. And yet it got pulled out somehow mysteriously for this thing that was planned all along.
Well, it was in the national stockpile. So
Okay.
we had a whole bunch of it just waiting to be used.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
So basically you went undercover, kind of. You're recording this, which is to your benefit because you kind of saw the forest for the trees, and that this could be a problem. However, it's going to play out because things didn't add up, right? Yeah. And so you're trying to do what the basic stuff you would normally do, and now all of a sudden it's taken a shift. Maybe you can carry forward from there.
Yeah, I mean, it took a shift immediately. So now in August of 2021, I mean, we're talking since February of 2020, right? And we had gone so far down this rabbit hole, again, medicine changed, and it was continuing to change. We still weren't given antibiotics to prevent a secondary infection. Even patients that were hospitalized for 10 days, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we would have white counts going up, fevers going up. Remember, these patients, they were laying in bed. They weren't getting up because they weren't getting nursing care. We were told that we didn't have to go in the room and provide that as we normally did to limit our exposure. And so at this time, when I realized that it was weaponized, the ivermectin, and then at the same time, the entire country, where it was getting coerced to take the shot or take the paycheck or their paycheck. And I said, okay, you know what? I'm seeing this. I had a case of a 30-something-year-old that had myocarditis, another one pericarditis, congestive heart failure, blood clots in children. And Dr. Bill, this was over 3 shifts. 3 shifts. All of the recordings that you see that I released was off of 3 shifts. And at that point is when I was like, okay, the world needs to know this, and I have to let them decide. And, I've been speaking out now for 18 months. And sure, I got through to some people, but, this was really an existential threat, I thought, to our society. And that's when I released it virally to the world and said, okay, here, guys, this is what I'm seeing. This is what people actually think in the hospital. These are what your doctors and your nurses think. Like, should we treat you if you're not vaccinated? Should we treat you if, you come down with COVID and you don't want to wear a mask? All of this bullying and coercion. Even my supervisor, she knew how I stood, because I never once took a PCR test at the hospital, right? I outright refused it. And she said to me, Jodi, you work for the government. You have to follow policy and protocol here, and you cannot educate on anything that is not ordered for the patient. And I said to her, like, do you not understand ethics? That is so wrong. That's called institutionalization. You know what I mean? And yeah, so that's when I released it and said, okay, guys, you decide.
And you had mentioned that they weren't collecting data. And now you're talking about people coming in multiple shifts and over short amounts of time with the myocarditis, with true vaccine injury, correlation straight, this took this and I got this immediately. And, those kinds of things. Now, there is a requirement, and that is that when there is injury, you're supposed to report it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, to my knowledge, they were not only not reporting, but they were encouraging people to not report. Did you kind of get the same feeling or not?
Well, 100%. We weren't recognizing safety signals. What our job is to report what we are seeing and what the patients tell us. It's not our job to determine causation. Well, here's the big problem with VAERS. When VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, for many of us, and I can't honestly go back to that time and remember, like, did I know about VAERS, or was it that I researched it? Because it definitely wasn't something that was pushed on us to recognize, right? And so that was the problem. There lies the problem in itself, is that if your medical professionals, especially your nurses, do not understand the function or the legal requirement to report to VAERS, then nobody's collecting data. And so, yes, they did not train us. They did not say, listen, guys, we are going to mass inject this population. We need you to report anything that you see, and so that was a big problem.
And I think that was also a big contributor to the underreporting challenges. If you're going to look for a safety signal, you need to try to get a good cross-reference of the population in terms of what's going on, which is maybe the theory behind utilizing something like that, even though they made it so complicated. People are like, I don't want to spend 20 minutes trying to figure this out and put one in. You know what I mean?
Well, and it takes that,
right?
Yeah.
I put one of these in, and now they're giving me less one. You get 3 of these and you're out, right? So carry us forward, because there's a lot more to this story. And if you would just carry on from there.
Yeah. One thing I do want to mention is after my whistleblower came out, it came out in September of 2021. October, the Indian Health Service, because I worked for the Native Americans, they were the highest affected population in the world. They lost 7 years off of their lifespan. And that was the first time that they put out any information on what an adverse event of special interest was. And that was, if you got COVID after the vaccine, that's reportable. right? So yeah, so after that happened, I was put on administrative leave. And then a couple weeks later, they put me on investigative leave. Then I was on that for a year, a little over a year.
Were you able to work during that time frame or not? Were you just
No.
completely on leave?
Right, because in order to, when you work for the government, if I wanted to get another job, I would have to get it approved, right? They need to know. And so, no, I was just on leave getting straight base pay. And, but what happened for me professionally was I had 18 board complaints against my license. And I went in front of the Arizona Board of Nursing for the final time in March of 2021 after I completed a formal ethics evaluation and I was cleared of every single one of those 18 charges. I think
Who
my
made these
hospital.
charges? Jodi, who made these charges against you?
Well, I know that it was some people I worked with because I could just tell by their complaint. The doctor that I exposed who said these vaccines are full of shit. They're trying to get the data. They want to kill people. Like she came out and said, I don't know why Jodi would do this. You know, she was a good nurse, why she would risk her license. But again, ethics, right? Like, and
Tell me the
so,
truth. This is your license, right? Back to that.
right, exactly. And so my job, you know, they were probably like, oh, she's probably going to get her license taken away. Well, that didn't happen. Finally, in November of 2021, the judge, the Merit System Protection Board. So finally, in November of 2021, the Merit System Protection Board judge said, "What are you doing with her? Do you have a determination?" And they said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, what are you waiting for? Like you wrapping it up as a bow and giving it to her as a Christmas present?" A week later, that's what they did, and they terminated. A week later, that's what they did. And then they terminated me, saying that I violated electronic policy, that I was AWOL, and that I violated PHI. But all of those things were not true. So a couple of years later, pardon me?
And you got cleared, right?
Well, I finally went to a 5-day hearing with HHS in June of 2023. And then the judge at that time said, I'm very interested in this case. I've taken over 130 pages of notes, and I am going to rule on this by October. And that was October of 2023. And here we are, 2026, and still hasn't happened yet.
Wow. So carrying forward, retaliation, that's kind of a retaliatory move, you would think, you know, losing your job. So that potentially has financial ramifications. And there was a pharmacist component, I believe, as part of that retaliation, or?
Well, the pharmacist, she put an order of protection on me. I fought it, had to go to court, a 2-day hearing where she was trying to silence me on the First Amendment to say that I could never use the words "the pharmacist" again. And the judge said that it was a tight case, but it's teetering on the First Amendment. And we're like, oh my gosh, here we are today, right? And then she doubled down and said that I did this all for personal gain and that she's suing me for $500,000. Basically, that I painted her in a false light. But, you know, I got recording. And the good thing, Dr. Bill, which I'm super excited about, is that a lot of recordings that I never released back then now can be released during this public jury trial. So I'm excited about that. Yeah.
Fantastic, because the truth will set you free, right? When you have the goods and the smoking gun and the real words, it makes it hard. You know, it's not a he said, she said. And you would think that the First Amendment would trump most things. I mean, you can't run into a theater and yell fire, right? And get away with that very easily. But you know, having your opinion based on your observations as a professional, okay, and the things that you're saying, yes, they're counter medical narrative, but you know, that's big pharma. You're entitled to your opinion, entitled to what you observe, and this comes down to the whole moral, ethical dilemma because,
Yeah.
in the hospital, your job is very specific. We'll bring her back. So in the hospital setting, I mean, you have a certain set of guidelines, right, in terms of what are really the controlling guidelines for your ethical parts and pieces. Maybe you could review that.
Yeah, definitely. So it's the same thing that VAERS, right? The VAERS, vaccine adverse event reporting. It's something that's just kind of brushed over in nursing school. Same with the code of ethics. It's kind of like, okay, here's what, should guide you. They don't talk about it. Many nurses, even my nurses that I precept in the ER today that are about to graduate over the last few years, I ask them all, hey, do you know about VAERS? Nope, they still don't. And do you know about the code of ethics? And they're like, oh, is that like autonomy, beneficence? I'm like, nope, those are principles. That's not the code. Those aren't the provisions. And to me, the number one thing I see, or maybe two things, right, is fear. People are fearful. People do not want to not be comfortable. So they will do whatever, they're self-protective. And it's interesting because the code of ethics says in its foreword that it is a living document. Okay. You know what other book says that? The Bible. Okay. So we got the Bible and the code of ethics. I tell people this. The code of ethics, or the Bible guides the believer like the code of ethics needs to guide the nurse. They are both interchangeable. And basically, there are different provisions. Like our number one most important duty is to the patient, not to the doctor, not to your charge nurse, not to policy or protocol. Our role is to be a patient advocate. And now the code of ethics just dropped 2025. The new code says that nurses need to give patients all the information, even if it's not available at the facility. So if a patient asks, do I have any other options? And you as a nurse, you follow in your code of ethics because that's also tells you to lifelong learning, right? That compels you to do that. Then you could say, yes, there is this that's out there, and you can help the patient with that. People don't understand that. They don't understand what the informed consent or shared decision-making component is. And as a nurse, I walk in there, I clock in, and I am an employee of that hospital. But once I accept an assignment, that patient becomes my number one reason for being there, and the code also goes into it and talks about moral courage, talks about supporting whistleblowers. It also compels you to blow the whistle. And that's what I want to tell people. And I want to help them and say, like, first of all, I thought I needed this large body of evidence before I came forward. And we don't. We just need to have a reasonable belief. And so this is what I want to let people know, that it is your duty to give all the information. It's your duty to talk, to be an advocate, to engage in the political process. You can even be an activist and be a nurse. Like, there's a lot, but people think I'm a good person, I don't need to know the code. They don't really understand what the code actually does for them.
Right. You mentioned a really important piece. There's a ethical writing principle: do no harm. And when harm is being done by the mandated policies and procedures, even in law enforcement, when we see something that's gone too far, we're not to just follow orders. We're to go, wait a minute, this is going over the line here. Okay. In healthcare, when you're aware that something is creating harm and you're seeing it come in day after day and you're searching for answers, you're basically doing what you're trained to do, which is, how do I find answers to this and question things? One of the things that we didn't get was basically informed consent. People were not really given informed consent, which, is a really big ethical issue. It seems like there's been some, effort to address some of that, because they recognized what a big problem it was. I mean, the doctors weren't notified about the side effects, complications, contraindications. The nurses certainly weren't notified. You weren't told about the VAERS in terms of what to report for safety signals. I mean, how many things can go wrong, right? And you're just watching it day after day. And some of it comes back to the hospital protocol and who drove that, right? The Fauci protocol drove the hospital protocol, and the hospital's like, hey, we're making lots of money. Don't rock the boat, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And people didn't want to speak up. And I get it. I mean, it's a machine, man. Like, it's a machine. And I was raging against it for 18 months until I was called to expose it. And I'm still raging against it. But again, even our ethics tells us, like, for example, I can't go back to a hospital system because my morals and my character, my integrity it would just be a bad relationship. So why put myself in there? So I have to find outside work, not in the system. But yeah, I mean, we have RFK Jr. with Secretary of HHS. That's a big blessing because he does know what's up. And I think he's really trying to, he's moving the needle on a lot of things. One of them, like you just mentioned, is informed consent. That's what he's compelling the doctors to do before they even inject, right? So when a patient does come in and want a vaccine, they should be given all of the information, which is we kind of don't know because we haven't done the research.
Well, you haven't been trained either. I mean, the doctors, what do they get? Like, 2 or 3 hours in vaccines, follow the schedule. They know the detail of what's in these vaccines and the contraindications and the complications than anybody off the street most of the time. And nor do they care. And that's a huge problem because, there are many potential complications. There are many adverse effects that can happen depending on your prior allergies and prior conditions and things like that. And yet they're not trained in it. So you're supposed to be able to believe that they actually were. We're back to a belief system, not science. Okay. Where'd the science go? I mean, this is not a religion. Why are we treating it like one? Right.
Yeah. 100%. It's a belief system. And that's why people are so emotional when they respond to you. And I recognize that early on. I didn't come out and speak out against the childhood schedule vaccines until probably like 2 years later, because I really needed to do my research. And who better to find, the starting point for research is moms and dads that have vaccine injured children. That's when I first learned about RFK Jr. And that's the thing. It is informed consent and shared decision making. Like, I give an example. I'm about to do a keynote address for student nurses here in Arizona, which I'm so excited about. And one of them is, again, we are here for the patient. I was a triage nurse. I checked this patient in, and it was a mom and a baby, a toddler, and they needed to get transferred out to Phoenix Children, but the child was stable, and the nurse and the doctor was saying, no, you have to go by ambulance transport. And she said, I don't have the money, and I think he's fine. He wasn't requiring oxygen, so there was no need to push that. I came out of my office and I said, do you understand, the reason they want, the ambulance? Anyway, I gave her the risk benefit of both of them, right? And the doctor was very risk adverse. The nurse was not a strong advocate. And I had her sign the form that she understood what the risks were and let her leave. And everybody was okay with that until I did it as a teaching point on social media and I went viral. And then they were like, oh my gosh, like, she's talking about this, she's violating HIPAA. And my CNO and CMO is like, no, she's not. She's using it as a case study.
Right.
And that's the thing. That's where institutionalization happens, and it happens very quickly. It happens the first time, that new nurse asks a question in huddle and everybody looks at them. Then they stop asking questions. And the problem with that, Dr. Bill, is that it's a patient safety violation or issue, because every time I go to work, every time I'm asking another nurse a question about something like, hey, do you know about this? Are you seeing something different? Like, we have to collaborate with one another. And when we have the nurse bullying, when we have people that are institutionalized and that want to freeze you out, and it's okay to come out and talk crap about the patient when you walk out of the room. Patients overhear those things. I just had one that was about to come over the desk and strangle the nurse that was saying something, like these are big issues. And that's why ethics is so important to me. Because I think if you know better, you're going to do better. If you have the language and you understand what you are actually obligated to, then it's a lot easier to bring up concerns and be vocal. And it all starts with knowing who your patient is. And back then, and when I was, looking into the code of ethics, it said in there that the patient is the community, the population. So right now, me speaking to you, and I have RN behind my name, right? I have an ethical duty to everybody that's going to listen to this. People don't realize that.
In the same with all of us that have a certain amount of training, but we also have discernment. We have eyes wide open some of the time. And we are trained, we're supposed to be trained observers to look at questions, speak about, and not just be a bunch of robots, following the directive, right? And so that's where there's the clash, because informed consent is a critical piece of the puzzle. And that's why advocacy is so important in the hospital, because maybe you're not all there. Maybe, you're in some state that makes it less clear for you if somebody's actually going to bother to do that. And so your advocate can be there getting that information. Well, what are you giving them? Why are you giving it to them? What's the efficacy of that? What's the downside if they do that? Is there an alternative to that that might be safer? Somebody that can advocate and ask those questions, or even, work with the patient on those kinds of things. Because when you don't have it, what do you have, right? Then you rely on the ethics of that particular nurse. And what you're saying is some of the people, maybe some of that ethics gets scared right out of them.
Yeah, immediately. It starts right away. It starts right away. It starts with that, nurse ratchet, that who's your preceptor, and, you can't ask questions. And, I love critical care, but that's where the biggest egos are. They're like, I save people's lives. I know everything, and it's like, no, we don't. And we have to be kind to the nurses. You see all these videos of nurses coming on and saying, you better hope that I don't get a nice patient, right? Because I'm not going to treat him, or I'm going to give him ketamine, or I'm going to kill him. And it's like, oh my gosh. But that's what we did during COVID. This all started because we allowed nurses at this station, nurses and doctors, to say that it's somebody doesn't care about their life if they don't put a mask on, and they don't care about others' lives. So we're not going to help them. That's where it all started. And they allowed that environment to prosper. And then remember, like you were mentioning, a lot of the nurses that did have ethics, they left the bedside. And so now you have all these young nurses that were charge nurse within 6 months to a year. Before, that would take 5 years before you could be in that position, and we have a lot of them, and they are suffering moral injury because of it, but they don't even know what it's called. Just like I didn't know that what I was doing was called blowing the whistle. They don't understand that what they're doing is really creating moral injury for themselves by not having the tools to speak out. And it doesn't surprise me that we're not taught that, because if we're taught that, then we can't be controlled.
Right. It brings up another kind of, piece of reality, and that is that the nurses were observing nurses taking these bioweapons, these injectable treatments, and having the side effects, and you're taking the very most critical group of people. And what did we learn later? Oh, yeah, that everybody at Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, they were exempted from taking those jabs. How come they got exempted, but the critical care first line responders all of a sudden got to do it to keep their job, and then they're dropping like flies? Yeah. So I'm sure you observed, nurses and coworkers around you that had problems. Yeah.
Oh, yes. But again, at that time, it was so new, and you were still questioning it. I was still observing. I was still, processing it through in my head. But now looking back at it, again, all those nurses that were calling out sick after taking the shot, that is an adverse event of special interest, getting COVID-19 disease after vaccination. That nurse that was 22 years old and had to wear a Holter monitor and be off of work for 8 months, that was an injury. But here's the interesting part. It was taboo to speak about all of this. And even still yet in 2026, I have nurses, people know who I am now. I hate it about being a whistleblower to the public because I love bedside nursing. I love it. And I just wanted to go in there and be Nurse Jodi. And I did until that video went viral and then everybody found out. But it's something I'm proud of, and it's something I would do again, 100%. But when you create the space for people to feel safe to tell their story, you know how many nurses, I work in a small facility, and I would say about 20% of them have vaccine injuries. One of them, which is so egregious, she literally went in, got the shot, left, went to her car dealership. While she was there, she felt like her throat having trouble swallowing. And she's like, oh my God, is my throat closing up? Drives herself to the emergency room. Next thing she knows, she's intubated, right? And they had to intubate her. She had a reaction, just a systemic reaction. And when she was extubated, they were like, what happened? And she said, I don't know. The only thing that happened was I just got this shot and now this is happening. And they're like, oh, it can't be that. Sure. I mean, this is how wildly blinded people are. And so because of that, that inflammation took over her body. And now she has multiple issues because we didn't treat her early and she was gaslit. That's a problem.
Yeah. And it repeated, rinse and repeat over and over and over again. If you were going to advise people, if you eventually end up in the hospital, right, in the current state of things, knowing what we know in the rearview mirror, what would be some of your advice to families, patients, etc.? One of the things that I ran across was, and it is, they want to get those vaccines in you one way or the other. And now the fancy term is biologics, right? You sign the big 40-page thing that nobody ever reads. Now it's electronic. They make sure you can't read it because it's electronic. It pops down to where the signature's at. You're having a heart attack. Where do I sign? Well, can we give you blood? Well, yeah. Where do I sign, right? But then embedded in there is language that maybe wasn't there before. How do people protect themselves now, looking back and looking forward?
Well, number one, the nurse needs to do their job and say, listen, I am here for you. I'm not here for the system, right? And to educate and let them know, any questions are welcome. Bringing the doctor to the bedside, staying in the room with the doctor and hearing what they're explaining, watching the patient's body language, and absolutely just letting patients know you can refuse anything. You can refuse anything. And a lot of people don't realize that even today, even the people that are quote awake, right? They still look like, can I say no? And it's like, yes, you absolutely can say no. You are in charge of your own care. You can get up and walk out of here and And, even though they're going to tell you that insurance might not cover it if you leave against medical advice, like that's not true. You don't have to stay. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to take anything that you don't want to. And so letting people know that people need to know like that, we have AI now. Super simple when you're in the hospital to ask for your lab results, ask for the medications, look up the risk and benefits yourself, look up the side effects if your nurse is not going to tell you. But yeah, I mean, having an advocate, we can never, ever, ever, ever again allow for that advocate to be removed and from the bedside for no reason, right? Not for a pandemic reason. I tell people this. When I was house supervisor, Dr. Bill, I was allowing family to come in. And when somebody asked me about it, the admin, they're like, what do you mean they had a patient visitor? I would go to the nurse and say, hey, do you feel comfortable? So-and-so wants to see blah, blah, blah. And they would say, yeah, sure. And then I would just document patient, educated on possible risk exposure, blah, blah, blah. And they couldn't say nothing to me because I knew what my role was. And that's why I think it's so important to get people back to that. And knowing like your role, for your patient's bill of rights. As soon as you get in there, ask them for that. Say, can you print me off a copy? If you are going in for surgery, ask, for that to be, say you'll sign it electronic, but you want to read it in paper. You know what I'm saying? Those little things. And just being informed of the care and, hopefully you have an advocate there. I mean, a nurse advocate is obviously probably the best to have because we understand the language and we understand the movement through the hospital and all the ins and outs of that. Because the advocate that you're going to get at the hospital is a hospital employee advocate.
Right.
They're not there for you.
Yeah.
Right?
Hospital advocate.
Yes. Yeah.
I did a little bit of research because I was curious about, the wrongful terminations and some of the awards and things that are out there. And I focused on hospitals because I want to get back to where you go with your case at this point. But interesting, wrongful termination, retaliation, and reporting safety standards and understaffed issues in a hospital, right? A nurse is reporting safety and understaffing problems. I can't keep up. You want me to be in 5 rooms and I can't be there at the same time. So it's a problem, right? I mean, you would think that would be just a normal thing, having a meeting and say, hey, what do we do? Mm-hmm. And so they're basically, kicking this person out. She sues. Jury verdict, $41.49 million for what they did to her career, right?
Yeah.
Next one, verdict to nurse was fired for reporting understaffing and other errors related to those kinds of concerns. This one was a $5 million award. Retaliation for raising patient safety concerns, right? How about those ventilators that people weren't trained in? Okay, shoving those things on people, because that was one of the big issues back then was, it takes a lot of really critical training to properly manage the ventilator. And people without the training were shoving those things on and people were expiring and whatever, but retaliation for raising patient safety concerns, $27.5 million awarded for the nurse, right? And I've got pages and pages of these.
That won't be me.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why, because I work for the government. So, people, the taxpayers were paying my paycheck. You see what I'm saying? So for me to get a big award like that won't happen. I don't believe. They did. I was forced, basically. The judge is like, you have to mediate. And I said, I'm not settling. I'm not settling. And he was like, you have to go through the process. And then when we came back out, the judge said, wow, I have never in all my years seen somebody, you guys, he said, you're not even on the same line here. You're all the way over here and they're all the way over there. There is no way you can mediate. And I said, right, because I have the truth on my side. They don't. And so I don't know what's going to happen with this. I certainly hope that, that I could see myself 5 years, like, because I was going to be with the government for the rest of my life. You know what I mean? Or until I retire. They were paying $20,000 a year to my student loans. I mean, there was a lot of benefits for that. But again, at the end of the day, so the judge bifurcated my case. So my whistleblower allegations of them suppressing ivermectin to push remdesivir, of them not reporting VAERS injuries, those types of things, he put the case together. So it's my termination and my allegations all wrapped in one. And he said he did that because he wasn't going to depose the same people twice, right? It's already expensive. I mean, we're hundreds of thousands of dollars into attorney's fees for this. So I certainly hope that, I mean, if you're asking me, I don't know if you're asking me this, but what I want to see happen is for this case to get so much notoriety that I can educate on ethics all day. That's my goal.
Part of that is a significant award, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
It's headlines, right? Searching out headlines. So that's a piece of it. It would, and so why should you have to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars again out of your own pocket over years, stretched out because you're trying to basically tell the truth, make informed decisions, do a smart thing, use things that are already accepted, and have discernment and the intelligence and the training that you have, as opposed to this dogma that comes down to oppress you and make so you can't use that kind of thinking. And it seems to be really much more pervasive now in the institutions and hospitals, where they're just like bean counters reading a script.
Yeah.
And you're losing the ability to think for yourself, right?
Yeah. And they, there's not much wiggle room for them to go off a protocol.
Yeah.
I say this, for example, you have somebody that gets C. diff. Okay. That is a really contagious, highly transmissible disease where you just poop constantly. Okay. You just can't stop it. And you have to go through all of these. I watched this 12 years ago when I was a new nurse. And the GI doc finally, came up and said, what about a fecal transplant? Okay. That's literally where somebody that you live with, doesn't matter, don't have to be related, your roommate would just poop in a cup. They would take it down to pharmacy, they would put it in, and then they would shoot it up in you. Okay. People recover just like that. And I asked the doc, I said, I was actually doing vancomycin enemas 3 times a shift. Okay. They went through so many different protocols. This patient's in there for weeks. And I said, what about the hospital acquired infections that they get? Why don't we just tell people here is your option. We could go straight to this and see, because it does work. And
anti-parasitic medicines, right?
Yeah, that too, right? Like, so.
Approach.
But I'm the nurse that will say that. I'm the nurse that is in the bedroom with the GI doc saying, what about a fecal transplant, doc? Yeah. Well, why are we doing that?
There's almost no downside. Just,
none.
I behind the scenes, we're about ready to do some Q&A. I've got Melissa preparing some questions, and I'd like to bring her on to maybe ask a couple of questions here as we get to the end of the show. Hi, Melissa.
Hi, Dr. Bell. Hey, Jodi.
Hi.
So, Jodi, obviously, I'm very well aware of your story. I'm aware of some things maybe other people aren't as well. Is there anything in your story or that you've gone through that you feel doesn't get enough attention that you would like people to know who watch this episode?
Wow. Good question, Melissa. I haven't been asked that. Oh, yeah. Probably let's talk about who the author of confusion is and who is the one that has the plans that he knows for us, right? So again, this is a spiritual warfare. I saw this in the beginning, 5-6 years ago now. We are at a time where I think the demons are literally raging in the heavenlies. And that right there is the number one issue, is that people are following fear instead of Yeshua, right? You need to look at the word. You need to look at scripture. This is not about a religion. It's about a relationship at the end of the day. I haven't had a church that I went to in 30 years. Okay. But I work on my relationship with the Lord. And that is what I want people to know, because if you have that, then you're not going to succumb to fear, and you are going to know that whatever plans he has for us, right? Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, saith the Lord, right? Anything that is not good, it does not come from God. And that's what I want people to have, is a relationship with the Lord. Same as when I had children. People are like, what do you want for your kids? And I had to think about that. And I said, for them to know the Lord, because no matter what they go through in life, I know they're going to be good because they have a relationship with him. So, yeah.
You have another question?
Yeah. So is there still an issue in the medical world of getting off-label treatment, or has that they don't look at people so crazy now when they suggest maybe ivermectin now, or is that still a big issue in hospitals?
Well, in my little microcosm of society, where it is a community of a little bit more than 100,000 people, people are more aware now, and they are not afraid to be vocal. But you still have a lot, for example, triaging a flu patient. And, nurse brings them back to the room, tells me, yeah, your patient XYZ, but they don't want a flu swab. I don't even know why they came in here if they don't want a flu swab. And I said, why do they need one? Well, why do they come here? And I said, listen to yourself. What are we going to do for them? What are we going to do different if they're positive or not? And then she's like, oh, I know. But people are not afraid to say that now. And they really appreciate when I walk in the room and I'm their nurse and I say, right, I understand where you're coming from and I'm here for you. You're not wrong. And that's what I really want to encourage other nurses to be true to yourself. I come outwardly with my faith, but I don't care if you're Muslim or Buddhist or whatever you bring to the nursing profession that is individual from, that is who you are. We can't separate that. We need to let nurses know that we do not leave our moral agency when we clock in. We are still the same person with integrity. And we have to honor that in every interaction.
You have one final question, Melissa.
Yes. In all of the years that you've been doing this, what do you think is the number one unethical or immoral practice that's done routinely without people really thinking about it?
Not giving patients all the information before they administer any medical intervention. Yeah. They don't really understand that we need to give them the risk and the side effects of medications. But I want to say one thing before we do leave, Dr. Bill, if you would allow Melissa to answer this question, because we know each other for a reason. And I think, let's talk about courage, Melissa. Talk about what you did and talk about how that came to be.
Well, honestly, it's when you do see something being done wrong and other people also agree that it's wrong but won't do anything about it. Somebody has to stand up and say, I'll do it. And so that's kind of what I did in my position. And even though I left, it took a month for me to see your interview, Jodi, which is what inspired me to come forward, because I saw just the ad of your interview, like the little, 1 minute, 2 minute ad for it. And you said, I fear God, not man. So why would I care what man thinks of me or is going to do to me if I don't speak up? And I just remember thinking, well, I believe that. Why aren't I trying harder? Because I guess I reached out to local news and to CNN and Fox because I didn't know anything back then about that, and never got anywhere. And I just sat there with this knowledge thinking I'm insane. Like, do I think this wrong when it's really not wrong? I think that's a thing that a lot of people get gaslight themselves on when they're, no matter where you're at, no matter what your job is, you get this, that doesn't seem right, but everybody else seems okay with it. And this is like the flow of the way the job goes. I don't want to be the squeaky wheel. I'm just going to do it too, or go with them. That's where you can really lose yourself and your moral integrity. And so,
and you didn't.
Yeah.
Go ahead. I wanted to get a couple final thoughts. Carrying forward, Jodi, we know that money's been spent, whether it's the monkeypox, disease X, bird flu, whatever. We know that money's been spent for more of these huge financial windfalls, maybe for a reboot. What would you advise people to think about as we move forward?
I would advise them to do whatever they can that's within their control. And that is what they're putting in their mouth. Looking at the new food guidance from HHS that just came down. A lot of people don't know that they flipped that pyramid upside down. So eating real food, staying away from sugar, getting sunlight, not being fearful, hanging out with people, getting physical activity, weightlifting. That's really big. And following God's plan for your life. Really submit your will to him. It's very easy. I tell people this. It's so easy. You just have to believe with just the faith of a mustard seed. Okay. So just a tiny, tiny, tiny bit that maybe Jesus is Lord and personal Savior. Maybe. And if you can do that and say, okay, Father, maybe I believe a little bit. Will you forgive me of my sins? Whatever I did. I'm just talking to me and you, not to a pastor and not to anyone else, just you and God. And you just asking and saying, forgive me of this and this. And you know what? Come into my life and work through me. That's it. That's all we need to do. And then no matter what happens in your life, because I did see this differently. I know Melissa's whistleblower too. We had what we thought was going to happen. We had hoped that what we were exposing was really going to make a change, but sometimes you don't know what that change is. Sometimes you don't know the people that you impact. But that doesn't matter because this world is not our home. Our citizenship is in heaven. And if you continue to live as a worldly being, you are going to continue to be beat down by fear, anxiety, depression, you name it. Other than that, you can live with, relationship with the Lord and rise above that and say, you know what? I'm a spiritual being. I was born again of spirit and not in flesh. So now I'm not living the same way I did. Now I'm renewed of mind, body, strength, and spirit.
Fantastic, Jodi. Thank you for coming on to the show today and sharing your story. It's quite impactful, and you can't argue against the reality of what you've experienced, what you know. And I really appreciate your time, and maybe we can do this again sometime. But thanks again, and thanks for tuning in to In the Lion's Den.
Blue lights and sirens, yeah, it's time to go. No time to defund us. You should know that we're not perfect. We're human, we're flawed. Just save us some grace for the sake of us all.